My name's Lisa Shull, and welcome everyone. I'm a volunteer and past board member with the Portland chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon. NPSO promotes the enjoyment, study, and protection of Oregon's native plants, and we welcome any new members that we have and any guests that we have tonight. As part of our mission, we present a speaker each month on timely topics of interest to our members. Our speaker tonight is Dane Miller with his presentation, Forests During the Time of the Mastodons, Ziegler Reservoir Fossil Site. We will get to his presentation shortly. So in the slides, you noticed that there was a new one this month, and it was advertising the Native Plant Appreciation Month, which is coming in April. And for all the details about the many programs and extra hikes and events that we have going on, please check your bulletin from the state or your Calicortis, which has a link into the chapter Google calendar. And that's where you can link in and find out and learn about how you can register for the hikes and everything. Now it's time to introduce our speaker. Dane grew up in Methow Valley in Washington State, along the eastern slopes of the North Cascades, near the confluence of the Methow and Columbia rivers. In the late 1980s, his parents owned a llama outfitting business, guiding 5 to 7 day trips through the North Cascade wilderness. Dane was employed as a junior llama wrangler, along with his brothers, to help guide baying customers into the wilderness. These early experiences of guiding and spending time in the wilderness were transformative and shaped his passion for botany and ecology, and I assume paleontology. Throughout his formative years and high school, academics were challenging Dane, who has dyslexia and had to work twice as hard as his peers for an average grade. This instilled in him a grit and passion for education, helping others, and teaching. Education would come full circle when Dane worked as a science teacher at the Sand Hill School in California, working with other students with ADHD and dyslexia. From 2000 to 2015, Dane worked closely with his brother Ian Miller, a paleobotanist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and he's now the chief scientist at National Geographic. Dane developed a deep fascination for plant morphology and systematics over the years of working with his brother. Dane has contributed to several high-profile paleontological projects: the Mastodon project in Colorado, the National Cleared Leaf Project in Washington, D.C. through the Smithsonian, and the Laramidia Project in southern Utah. Dane now lives in Portland with his wife, Amy, and 2 small dogs, Chimmy and Burrito. He currently works for Care Oregon as a data and analytics trainer, continuing his passion for helping others. Dane received an MS, Masters of Science in Botany from the University of Wyoming, and then another Bachelor of Science in Biology from Seattle University in Washington. Welcome, Dane. We look forward to learning about the mastodon and paleobotany.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me get the slides set up here. So just give me 1 second. Well, thank you so much. My name is Dane Miller. And over last year, I was reached out to the Native Plant Society here in Portland, just trying to find ways of getting involved back with sort of my passion with botany. And it had been about 10 years since I've really worked on this stuff a lot. So just trying to find new ways of getting back in. So last year I reached out. There was an opportunity this year that Willow, who's one of the members, board members, invited me to present this year. So I'm really excited to share some of really cool story and some science around what I did and kind of a bigger picture of this Snowmass. So what the sort of the goal of this presentation today, before we get into the slides, because there will be, is really kind of showing the importance and the discovery of the Snowmass project, kind of why it was so amazing, what are the different things that we found, going into a little bit of the geology, and then going into what I think is the fun part, which is the plants. So I'm a little biased, but that's sort of the goal. And if you have questions, I'd encourage you to drop them in the chat. We can address all of those at the end. So let's orient ourselves for this talk. So where are we? So up in the left-hand corner is Portland, this little yellow square, and down in the middle here, this is Snowmass. And we're going to focus in on this area here in a little bit. But I wanted to kind of take a look at this map. When we think about this, this is what North America looks like today. We have polar ice caps on either poles. We can see up here, Greenland is capped with ice, and then likewise with Antarctica. But this is not always the case. So about 35 million years ago, and even further back in the time of the dinosaurs, Earth was during a time of where it's called a greenhouse Earth. So it was much warmer, sometimes hotter. And some of the work that I've contributed to, and this is part of that Laramidia project in southern Utah, was digging up these fossils, both plants and dinosaurs here. So you can see here is up on the top with the pickaxe is my older brother Ian. There's another intern. This is myself, and my mom actually contributed to many of these digs. So she kind of an integral part of doing a lot of feeding people and a lot of different things. So sometimes it takes just a lot of different people to come together for any one of these expeditions. So southern Utah, this area is focused down in kind of near Escalante. There's huge sort of sand cliffs that are out there. It's very rugged, pretty steep. As you can see, these angles are 45, 50 degrees. It's pretty treacherous. This is just a slab that was taken out of that hillside down in southern Utah, and you can see these amazing fossils, and this really depicts that warming period in the Earth's climate. Scroll a little bit forward, we can see some of these amazing dinosaurs. This is a ceratopsian, a type of triceratops, and then sort of the plant depictions that can really tell us a lot about the landscape and the dinosaurs, sort of a little bit about that past work that contributed to. And you can see the dinosaurs, it was a very different, warmer, hotter place than it is today. We're going to take a dive into a different realm of the Earth. So what we call kind of an ice house or a cooling Earth is much different than our present Earth right now. And it is very different from that time of the dinosaurs were roaming the Earth as well. So a lot of the landscape in North America was covered by huge sheets of ice, blocks of ice across North America. And intermittently, as we could see, this goes back to where it was present. So it was always cool. And then sometimes it got really cold. And so the really cold periods are what we consider that as the Ice Age periods. And you can see if you're up here in the Northwest, in Seattle, Portland, probably likely covered with ice. Down in Colorado, there's ice and snow, glaciers in the mountains. Much of the northern plains are covered with miles of ice throughout this area. How much ice was in here? And this is kind of just to sort of set the stage of before we get into sort of looking at some of the amazing pictures that we'll take a look at is, just north. I'm in Portland kind of area, but if you go to, Seattle, there's a Space Needle there, something like 3,000 feet of ice just covering the landscape. And it's really hard to imagine that much of volume of ice. It's a very different world. This ice that we find in places like Greenland, Antarctica, the northern poles, scientists really go to these areas to find evidence of climate change, the changing of the world that we can find through the keys of understanding and doing science on this ice. So here you could see some scientists, they're taking ice cores. This is probably in Greenland. So I've always wanted to be part of one of these expeditions. I think that it looks pretty fun. Then from those ice cores, we can the scientists can recreate past environment or understand what that environment looked like through temperature, carbon dioxide, and methane. These are intervals. So we're talking about climate changing over time. It's sort of going from a cool and cold transitions over time. And so 800,000 years ago, it's a long, long time ago. It's probably some of the most early humans to present, when we could see these intervals of cold and warm and vice versa that go up and down. And scientists can tell this by the percentages of carbon dioxide that's locked in the ice. They can do some measurements and calculations within the ice that reveal this information. They can, from that, they get the carbon dioxide, the methane, and then interpret through a set of tools of what that past temperature would have been like in those different ages in the past. So all the way over to the very right, 0 is where we're thinking of where we are today. And we're going to go back almost 200,000 years to look at our talk today. So during the last ice age, and this is the last ice age ended around 16,000 years ago. This is a artist image on the Front Range of Colorado. So if anyone's ever been to Denver, places like that, this is Long's Peak in the back, which is it's pretty iconic peak, the Front Range. And this landscape was dominated by animals such as mammoths, mastodons, camels across here. Today, this landscape is vastly different. This is probably the case for many of these landscapes across North America, that we would find these kind of animals and fossils. But we're going to segue from that Colorado on the Front Range area and move a little bit more inland to central Colorado of the within the Colorado Rockies. And this is an image kind of looking down on the Snowmass ski resort. That's this mountain here. You can see all these ski runs, and it's pretty amazing place if you haven't visited. And then what we're really going to focus on is this little depression right here. This is the Ziegler Reservoir. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is important. So just a little different view of what Snowmass looks like. This is a image in the spring, or maybe late or fall, or probably in the spring because the leaves are still pretty green. In the background, this is Mount Daly. It's a 14,000 foot mountain. It's very iconic in Colorado. That depression sits right here where my cursor is. And this elevation of where Snowmass Village sits about 8,200 feet. So if you're in the Portland area, Seattle or California, this is considerably higher than your elevation. Maybe if you're tuning in from Colorado, this is several thousand feet higher, but it's still pretty significantly higher. So about in the 90s, the Ziegler Reservoir was actually was used as kind of like a fish pond for the family of the Zieglers, and it was a little lake of sorts, not very deep, maybe about 6 or 7 feet deep at the most. And it wasn't until about 2010, in the October 2010, this construction worker, Jesse Steele, driving his big bulldozer, unearthed some mammoth bones within the peat and sediment that you see in the background. So just kind of like, what is this sediment? We're going to take a look at a little bit more of what this is, but it's sort of made up of this top part where construction workers were removing all of this because they wanted to expand this reservoir for more water for the whole town of Snowmass, because water is an issue in Colorado, or it's an issue anywhere really. And so expanding the reservoir, moving out all this extra sediment was really the goal of the construction workers. But when we, as I'll say, as the Denver Museum, as I was part of at that time, really looked at this as sort of 3 different sort of main sediment types. As muck on the top, which was more recent. We go back to that lake period where people had fish within it, a clay, a thick, hard clay, and then a peat layer underneath that clay. So when construction was going on, we're removing just tons and tons of sediment material from here. This is where the discovery really started. So when construction workers were moving this bulldozers, they unearthed tons of bones, like literally thousands. I think upwards of 15 to 20,000 fossils of fossil mammals. These gentlemen are holding mammoth tusks that were unearthed within the peat. This is I'm going to just show it. We're going to go through some of the cool discoveries of the animals before we get into the plants. But this is, might not look recognizable, but this is a mammoth tooth. So this massive animal, a Columbian mammoth. The tooth would be right from this little area up here. This is an image back in the 1940s or 30s at the Denver Museum. These are huge animals. So our artist reconstruction of what this animal looked like, it's standing about, at its shoulder. It looks probably, 10 to 12 feet high, up to its shoulder. Massive tusks, very broad shoulders, very large animal. We also found other types of animals. This is another little shot. My mom participated in this dig as well. But this is an image of a mastodon tooth. And you can see this is very different from a mammoth tooth. And the reason why I want to sort of show this and bring it up is because we can talk and think about the environment differently just based on the teeth of these animals. This is a juvenile mastodon. We can see the teeth down here and a tusk coming out. What do these animals look like? They were stockier, they were shorter than Columbian mammoths, and scientists believe that they're actually a little more aggressive, maybe in more woodland type of areas than kind of that tundra type of environment that we think of mammoths. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what that animal would look like if we came across it in Snowmass. So construction continued over the course of the fall of 2010, all the way into, and then took a break, and then it ended all the way up from October 20th through almost Thanksgiving. It kind of ended basically because of the weather, because you can't really dig when it gets several feet of snow covering. But it started up again in the spring when the snow melted, and there was really a time crunch on the scientists and all of us to dig these fossils before the reservoir was filled, completed. And so you could see this, just kind of showing you the amount of material that's moved. Here's how I'm running along the side of this big bulldozer, and this is peat and mud that we're trying to trench through here. And then while these machines are going through, they're kicking up a lot of different material. And so unfortunately, when we found a lot of the material in the fall of 2010, the machines would kind of break some of these tusks, and we could see this. And this is not ideal if you're in the museum world or a scientist. You don't want the bones to be broken. It damages the scientific quality of it. But then, there were a lot of glamour shots throughout the experience up there. This construction worker holding a mastodon tibia. We found giant sloth bones over on the right-hand side as just an image of a sloth, down in Costa Rica or South America. And this is a sloth bone really coming from that shoulder area. And this is that scapula part on the upper arm. This is what a reconstruction of a giant ground sloth would look like. And this is if you go to the Denver Museum, you could see this on display, and a reconstruction of what that is for artists. But there are other amazing things there as well. So not just the mammoths and sloths, there's also bison. And this is a massive bison that was discovered from tip to tip, is around 8 or 9 feet from those horns. Just a very different animal than the kinds of bison that we know today. So I know a lot of people say buffalo, the North American buffalo, but buffalo in North America are not buffalo, they're actually bison. So our bison is a smaller animal here, which is our present buffalo that we call. And then bison latifrons is this ice age bison that roamed around during that time of Snowmass. You can see these horns are just immense animal. There's also other things such as ice age deer that were walked through here. So we could see these antlers, the head of the deer. This is an artist reconstruction. And then some more really fun glamour shots. There's all sorts of people love to take pictures with giant bones. This is a image of a mastodon femur that these two gentlemen are holding next to them. You can kind of get the image of how big this animal actually is. So as I mentioned, this work, as we started in the October 2010, and tried to work all the way up until we couldn't work anymore. And so the weather just started in kind of around before Thanksgiving of 2010, it started snowing and getting really cold. And so the snow just started coming down. You can see me here. We have a cat jacketing this mammoth tusk or mastodon tusk down here below. And then after, in the springtime of 2011, around, I think May, the Denver Museum group came back kind of brought back more people and just started digging more. Just the amount of manpower with shovels going through the soil and the mud, try to find bones that were there. And it's just an image. This is me in the background of, you can see kind of some of the you know, what the elements that we're up against when we're kind of out there. Just you know, here are a couple other images. We're get into some of the other stuff here soon, but we had a lot of the construction workers. We were working on an active construction site along with scientists. And so these construction workers were driving on this area and getting stuck. We have this big backhoe or forklifts is stuck out here. You know, they had huge excavators that were stuck in the mud and had to pull them out with other machines. It really required manpower from the Denver Museum, and then hundreds of volunteers just digging by hand so that we can find these fossils. This is an artist reconstruction of what we tried to depict of how much an individual, you can see this little block down here, and typically of how much volume that we were sort of the Denver Museum was faced with trying to remove before this project of the reservoir was supposed to be complete in the fall of 2011. So we're kind of up against it a little bit, which is typically not the case in most paleontological studies. It's another volunteer with a big tibia, another big mastodon bone. Here's some really cool, this is a camel tooth. There's a reconstruction of that camel. We found wild, you know, there are horses. You know, horses today come from, you know, the Eurasia. So modern horses are not native to North America. So, but 100,000 years ago, there were horses in North America. And these are very different than the ones that people are accustomed to today. And then there are very, very small dinosaur, very, very small bones that were found there as well. So this is there was an opportunity where kids were able to come with some families and school groups and participate in the dig. And this was I think a kid of one of the construction workers, and he found this tiny little bone. And these little bones actually turned out to be bones of salamanders. And these salamander bones were packed inside the mammoth and mastodon tusks. These tiny little bones, these are little vertebrates. This is a femur. Yeah, other little bones here. And this is, you know, we have salamanders that we found out at the site while we were digging, but these were, you know, still living at that time, these salamanders, just hundreds of them that we found, bones of them 100,000 years ago old. Another fun little artist reconstruction of what these little salamanders use the mammoth and mastodon tusks as little reservoirs or homes, you know, to live in after those animals had died. You know, along the, you know, sometimes we could find these big banks of bones that were crossed here. And I show this image as just to show it's just literally at some areas of this site, you could stick your shovel in and within 10 minutes, you could find a bone. And it is really unheard of in most places around the world. So it's just a special place. And these are mastodon bones. You can see ribs. I think this is a vertebra that are in here, and they're all kind of scattered across this landscape. So a lot of people ask, like, how did these animals die here? Why were they coming here? And things like that. And this sort of, artist reconstruction shows these mastodons coming to the Ziegler Reservoir, that site, thousands of 100,000 years ago. And they probably came there because they were foraging, using it as a refuge, very similar to what elephants do in South Africa. So this is in, I believe, South Africa. Elephants come to watering holes. They're very social animals. They'll come back to areas where their other, sibling elephants had died and come back years after years. So it's most likely, one of those things where the animals died. They either just naturally died over time and then were buried, as this example just shows an elephant under the water in a shallow lake in Botswana, Southern Africa. And then some of these bones were, another an example. This is kind of what we look at, these kind of examples of bones strewn across the landscape. If you're a paleontologist, you call this sort of taphonomy. So how do we understand sort of the distribution of how those bones were displaced? How can we recreate that environment of how those animals died? And so most likely this elephant was probably eaten by some larger predator, lions or hyenas, and their bones are sort of picked apart. And there's evidence of that at the Snowmastodon site, of predators eating some of the bones, but we didn't actually find any of the kind of, the really cool saber-toothed cats or dire wolves or any of those things that people really would love to see. But here are some of the animals that we did find that we just went through. And then there's over 48 species of mammals or animals that were found within this site. So it's making it one of the most richest paleontological discoveries for a high elevation in or at a ice age site in the world. So it's a pretty significant and important site. Now we're going to start to transition a little bit and start thinking about sort of how did this lake form? So going back to that, looking at North America and this during that cold phase, or when it was much colder, ice age was covering North America. Ice was coming down through the Rockies and in the Cascades. Glaciers were filling up, and the Bonneville flats were filled with water at that time. And just a reminder, just to visualize or think about how thick that ice was. This is not just little ice. If you go to Glacier Peak or look at the ice on Mount Hood or Mount Rainier, we're talking about thousands of feet of ice. So it's significantly different than really anything that we can imagine today other than Greenland. So we'll take a sort of a little yonder back over to Snowmass. We can take a look at our Mount Daly in the background. This is our site here, the Ziegler Reservoir, and we can see it's just this is during a time when it was an active construction site. And this map, all this little blue, is really just showing that where the ice was coming down those valleys. And so it was approximated based on geologic evidence that the ice was about 800 feet thick. And we can see the little star here is right where the reservoir is. And it's most likely that this ice kind of pushed out a little blip into the site of the ridge, formed a lake. Let's see if I can move this down here. Formed a lake about 128,000 years ago. This lake, during that time, this is where we would see those mastodons, giant sloth, this bison ladder fawns, kind of occupying this space around that around the lake. And then over time, it could have been 8,000 or 10,000 years later, this isolated lake slowly starts to fill in. And so this artist recreation, we can see bones that are strewed across the landscape. Some of them are buried, get pulled down further into the lake by falling down, maybe by little landslides. And then over time, this lake filled completely in, and sediment blowing in from different places in Colorado, maybe even the Great Plains or Utah, filled in this lake, and it changed the landscape too. So the landscape at this time, 70,000 years ago, was much cooler, probably colder than it was in some of those earlier images. And these are mammoths. So it's a much colder environment. There's more of a tundra-like environment. And this is what it would look like if it's a huge project, the Snowmass project. And so this is, artists were involved in it, at one point, National Geographic and other, science and different groups were involved in kind of adding their expertise and into this discovery or helping promote it. And then about 50,000 years ago, we think that there's evidence that the lake kind of came back. Maybe it, became a little wetter or cooler, filled back, turned into a lake again. And then about, most recently, and this would be when I arrived and others at the Mastodon site, was it had filled all the way in, or just very shallow little area where water was still present. In 1958, that's where I'm talking about this little shallow area that was where they had fish and things in here, but you could sort of like visually kind of think about, so bones were sort of strewed across this landscape in different intervals of time. Mammoths, mastodon bones, bison. And we're going to come back to this graph that we looked at earlier of what that time period was over the last 800,000 years. And this band, this blue band here, really marks the period of snowmass, about 90,000 years of Earth history that was captured during this time. So it was in a cool and cold period. So it's kind of an interesting time. Not only was it not a full ice age, but it was also, we did see sort of an that ice age kind of environment as well. So how do we know some of these changes that take place and sort of kind of recreate the kind of that scientific background? A lot of this comes from the marine isotope cores, and these are cores that are drilled from thousands of feet within the ocean. Different sediment layers here have isotope signatures that represent different changes in the Earth's atmosphere over time. And over time, scientists can take this information and create an isotope stage of where we can sort of start to piece together where the snowmass snowmass story falls in place with the Earth's history. And so when we look at this is isotopes are, they are a little, I'm not going to get into the chemistry, but But anyways, just think about it as the isotope can tell you if it's going way up, that it's warmer in this negative part, and if it's really cool in these like bluer areas, that this is, it tells you that it was much cooler. So the marine isotopes are actually, it can tell us a lot about what's going on globally in the Earth. And so we're going to focus in on this little band here where it was pretty warm, almost warmer than it was, and about as warm or maybe a little warmer than it was today, and then going pretty cold over about a 90,000 year span. So this is just an image. I think I like to show this. It's just that, the Muir Glacier in Alaska, over about 60 years, excuse me, a massive amount of ice has melted and sort of shaped this landscape. And so with that ice retreating and moving back up into the mountains or further into the colder areas, brings plants. And plants is really where my part of the story comes into it. So I'm a paleobotanist. I studied the conifer cones that were collected at this site. But really, a lot of the question that comes is, modern botanical studies, focus on the whole plant. So if you go out and you're collecting, native plants, you could see the whole plant. You could find all the petals, the different parts of it. And it's pretty easy. It's much easier to tell you what kind of plant that is. Paleobotany, we're only rely on pieces of the plant. So it's very difficult, or much more difficult, to sort of piece together the story based on the evidence that you have. One of the primary evidence that we have for paleobotany comes from what we see here is pollen. And so how do we understand the landscape ecology during the paleoenvironment? So a lot of this comes from pollen. So understanding pollen, this is the little pollen grains here from this spruce or pine tree. And so again, similar to where I was showing those ice cores, or sorry, not the ice cores, the marine cores. Scientists go out into shallow lakes, different areas across the country, and take core samples. And in these core samples, they can find these different volumes of mud. Some of these can be, hundreds of feet long, and this is just broken up. And some of these sections can be broken down into where I'm just, where there's different changes in the color actually might indicate there was a change in the climate, the ecology. And we find these by doing some microscope work to sort of really investigate sort of those differences of the pollen. See if I can move this down a little bit. Sorry. And so as we go try to understand sort of the big picture of what was the ecology or the landscape look like at Snowmass 100,000 years ago, we do this mainly through pollen. And so pollen can give us information at the genus level. So when I talk about the genus level, if you think of the hierarchy of the kingdom, class, phylum, and it goes all the way down to genus and then species. The genus level is one step up from where we can understand the species. So all of these little top portions up here are different genuses of plant types. So Pseudotsuga, that's Douglas fir. Picea is spruce. Abies is fir. Pinus is a pine. And these are some other varieties of grass and other shrubs and things over here. But the interesting to note with this is just that as we look at modern pollen and elevation, that the pollen changes. So you can see elevation from, down, this is in Colorado. So, pine is pretty consistent. You can see Douglas fir is more consistent, sort of lower elevations, consistent, within, these are meters. So this is up to about, between 6 to 8,000 feet and so on. So you could kind of think of like, these are alpine zones in this yellow crumults. It's kind of like that in-between zone between, actually these might be switched, but between that tundra and alpine. Spruce fir, kind of the mixing area of different types of trees, and then a lower elevation of spruce, pine, and mixed conifers that would include this Douglas fir. This is what we would kind of expect in a normal or a day's environment. If we look back and we kind of try to recreate the past with the pollen that we have, we look at the Snowmass site here. There's this is another image that's just showing one of the banks over here. But on this elevation gradient, this Glenwood Springs it's about maybe 50 or 60 miles from the Snowmass Reservoir. And it kind of gradually increases from this desert sagebrush all the way up to a kind of a tundra environment that we look at these mountains in the background. So back to our isotope map. The last ice age that we're most familiar with in the North America is called the Pinedale glaciation. And that's a really, low, it got really cold during that time. So if you think about the last ice age, that's what this is referred to, or we're really looking at sort of these areas of this grouping of these numbers of the fives over here. So it was warm, cool, and then kind of warmed up again. And these maps, I don't know why they kind of they changed. One way it's to the right, the other way is to the left, with the increase in the thousands of years, but this is older, Ziegler Reservoir, kind of going to present on the right, or on the left, sorry. And if we look up the valley of, here's Mount Daly again, a typical tree line. If it got warmer, that tree line would increase. If it got cooler, the tree line decreases. So what can we see from some of that macro, so for some of the pollen and other macrofossils that were found here? So I worked on these fossil cones that kind of, we often joke that they sort of look like little animal droppings or cat turds or something, but it's not too pleasant looking. But this was where I did most of my work studying these things. Not as maybe as interesting looking as some of those mastodon bones. Also, there's many trees that were sort of fallen into this lake, and we cut them open to look at the rings of these trees. This is just a slide showing kind of the diversity of pollen that was sampled there. So Abies is fir, we have spruce, Douglas fir, and a variety of different sort of smaller shrubs, pine. And then some of the tundra environment. So this is we get sort of the sedges and grasses, some of the asters or the smaller flowering plants or ephedra growing within the bogs around in that area. So with the cones, we collected over a 2-year period about 200 fossil cones, and they are wet. All the fossils that were collected there weren't completely fossilized like dinosaur bones. They were actually still the actual organic material. So I took these cones and I would have to figure out my job was to figure out what they were. And you can see the variety of different cones that are in here. is an image of a giant tree that had fallen into the lake. Some more images of trees and debris that had fallen in here. And we can also understand a lot from the trees, the wood that had been fallen into the lake. We have these, we had some dendrochronologists that helped kind of reconstruct some of that past paleo environment. I know we've showed this image before, but this is kind of really based on some of that pollen data, the macrofossils, how we can piece this landscape together of what it sort of used to look like. It might not look that much different than it is today, and that's probably true. Ziegler Reservoir, I'm just going to we're going to go through what this looks like for some of these pollen zones. These are pollen zones over here on the right. These are some of the different types of genuses of trees over here in the green, some of the sagebrushes in yellow, and then aquatic plants over here in the blue. So as I click through here, you can see this little blue that will go increase, and you can start to think of like how the environment changes as we go through the ages of this reservoir. So we're thinking back 130,000 years ago, this is sort of a tundra environment, windblown, the sedges, small plants growing through here. As we go through and it sort of ages in different stages of this, this actually changes to more, we could say it's sort of a mixed conifer forest, drops out significantly of that sagebrush area within the image. You know, this is taken in, I think from California, but California has, or even Southern Oregon, a real great representation of the Douglas fir oak forest. They do not exist today in Colorado as what we would find them in that paleo environment. As we keep moving up through this age group here and this paleo environment of looking at these, the Ziegler Reservoir, we can see that this is that pollen zone of these Douglas fir, as well as spruce and other kinds of grasses that are coming through here. And then approximately about 120,000 years ago, this landscape changed again into something similar to southern Colorado and the San Juan Mountains, where it was sort of dominated by fir and spruce. And we can kind of see some other, you know, and this may have been a time when the lake was filling with water, and we could see these aquatic kinds of plants that were filling in this area. I like something similar to this. I propose, you know, there was at one point we were trying to figure out if the lake was drying or filling, and if we're drying out, does that mean the lake is completely dries up and there's all this clay that's in it, or is it filling up from a source of sediment coming in or windblown sediment coming in from elsewhere? As we creep up through early, you know, more to closer to present, the vegetation changes significantly again back to sagebrush. And this is about 100 to 90,000 years ago. It might look something like this, is sort of taken near northern Wyoming in kind of near the Tetons. I think getting kind of closer to the end of that sort of age span of the Ziegler Reservoir, we kind of see a big spike within spruce, some cypress within this range here. Now this might look something like, you know, we have a, you know, some area where it's sort of wetland and tons of spruce that are along the edge here of a kind of a filling in lake. And finally, at the very, uppermost part of the Ziegler Reservoir, it's again dominated by sedges and these aquatic plants. And this is really evident, this is sort of sagebrush area and, kind of like dry Colorado, but this is kind of the time when you would think of mammoths walking across this landscape, cooler, drier conditions. So the fossil pollen really tells us the story of going up and down from warming and cooling across the landscape of these zones, which are called the pollen zones. But how did I spend the time to actually identify what these cones were? So some of these, fossil logs, this is an analog sort of at the Hanging Lake in Colorado. There's many of these in alpine lakes. Flip through a few of these, but some of them are 2 to 3 feet in diameter. Tons of huge logs. You can see the grains of these. And the scientists can use this information to recreate kind of, from matching up different logs of trees that fell down about sort of environments that were less favorable to more favorable in ecology around the lake. And this is 2 different trees that kind of overlapped, that they found the rings really matched and overlapped at a particular time, and could tell that there was really a story between 2 trees that lived around the same time. So the conifers, we're going to dive into this a little bit, but there was Douglas fir. So these Douglas fir has these cones. It's not a true fir, they're hanging cones. It's pseudotsuga, means fake fir. And they have these bracts. They're actually pretty long, which are pretty evident when you find them. But these are not evident on the fossil cones. So they're just worn off. They kind of look like they've been sitting in a lake or a river for a long period of time. We also found, Engelmann spruce. So this is a image modern. Extant means modern. Engelmann spruce, and these are the cones that were found from that. And they don't really look that recognizable or interesting. And then to really identify these, I had to take apart the cones to look at the structure of the cone scales, and these little teeny tiny structures on them called bracts, and compared a morphological study between the fossil and modern cones. And we could see here a fossil cone of this Engelmann spruce, a white spruce, and then a modern Engelmann spruce over here on the far right. We also found a fir. So the modern fir, we have subalpine fir and white fir. I did this by identifying using the bracts. These are these little teeny structures on the inside of the cone scales. So some look really kind of wavy and kind of fan-shaped, which is a white fir. And this very pointy, rounded sort of edge is a subalpine fir. And so a lot of work went into this, collecting hundreds of cones, measuring them across different latitudes and environments across the Western North America. But it's just a snapshot of sort of Alaska, Idaho, Wyoming, and looking at this subalpine fir of how the morphology kind of changes within the cones or the cone scales, but the morphology is the shape of these bracts stay relatively stable and can be used for species level identification. So a white fir, these are common. You can actually find these in Oregon. The cones go straight up. This is what a fossil looked like before all the cone scales fell off. I took apart hundreds of these cones, looked at all these bracts to determine sort of the fossil morphotypes of 1, 2, and then kind of sort of tried to think about where these might go to California, Colorado, New Mexico, or in this case, it's a subalpine fir from Colorado. So white fir is kind of distributed across these green areas in the North America, kind of comes up into Oregon. If we, if you're in Oregon, all throughout California. In Colorado, it's kind of stays more southern Colorado and doesn't quite get up to Aspen and Snowmass today. So this kind of range here is the San Juan Mountains. This little dot is where Snowmass is today. So it's approximately 100 miles that, that it's not found in today's environment. So the Pleistocene range for these unknown, for the white firs, we have this little dot here, that's where our site was. But we don't really know where these trees may have gone, how did they migrate through these different populations? There's more work that needs to be done on this. But I spent time kind of looking at sort of the morphological differences of kind of looking at length and width and the shape of these bracts, comparing them with each other. And this is 2 different sort of time periods of 2 different kinds of firs. And you can see they kind of fall out in 2 different groupings across here, and I kind of made a distinction of this red line. But the kind of the one part of this whole story that I kind of haven't finished, and it's kind of like really re-energized kind of doing this talk, is looking at a possible extinct conifer species that is that might be new to science, and which is this cone here. And we think it is most similar to a blue spruce. You can see its distribution here on the right. The blue spruce is kind of common to the Colorado blue spruce, but they have the unknown spruce kind of have as a wavy cone scale, similar to what like a white spruce might have. And blue spruce cone scales are very brittle. They're dry out. You probably see these if you walk around. But the bracts is where we could find some really interesting insights. So the unknown spruce has this very distinct morphology, unlike any of the other spruce species that we know of today. And some of the hypotheses that I sort of ponder is that, is this sort of a relic population that we're seeing from the Brewer spruce in southern Oregon, Northern California, that sort of expanded to warmer climates all the way out to Colorado? Or is this something of in those cooler or different climatic periods of the Chihuahuan spruce, the Mexican spruce, that migrated more into northern latitudes up to where we are? I'm still doing some work to determine this. Start a couple key takeaways here. We're kind of wrapping it up, but the Snowmass site is really sort of defined by the diversity, the elevation of in the Rocky Mountains, and the time that is covered during the Pleistocene and its preservation. It's important to remember that this site is only one locality, and we need more to really get a better understanding of what's going on. provides insights into high elevation plant ecology during the Pleistocene. Small changes in these climates at high elevations become amplified as compared to lower elevations. In Colorado, or any high elevation, there's dramatic systems in these changes when temperature changes happen. Just a little snapshot, more recent work I'm doing of going down to Oregon State University, trying to do more measurements, collecting more data on the Colorado blue spruce to supplement understanding how we can fit this into describe it clearly. Just some fun pictures at the end. We had a lot of fun on this dig. This is a mastodon bone, and people tried to drink the water out of it. My mom, quite a character, but holding this bone here. There's a book that was written on this. You can look it up, but I don't know why they plastered my face on the cover of it. And this is a big old mastodon femur. There's a Nova documentary on this. It's called The Ice Age Death Trap, which is a little misleading, but it gets the viewers to tune in. You can look that up. And then there's tons of scientists, and I don't want to, that would be remiss if I didn't show some of these people. It's my older brother, Ian. These are a lot of the geology and stratigraphy people, a lot of the geochronology folks, paleontology group. There's just tons of people that contributed to this area. We even had ADNA, which is fossil DNA. Paleobotany group, this was my advisor, Stephen Jackson. There's all these different people contributed to the understanding of that ecosystem. The micropaleontology, this is the little invertebrates, the insects, the pollen, a variety of different things. And then I don't know if many of you know, but there's a famous artist that often goes on some of these digs is Ray Troll, and he was on the site and created this image. So anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. I know I'm over about 10 minutes. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm happy to take questions, and if anyone wants to I'm happy to entertain any questions that anyone has.
Okay, well, we did have a few come in, and then we can open up the screens and let people ask others. Let's see, I kind of had one at the beginning that came back again. Where exactly in Escalante were you working?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Escalante, so it's the Kuiperowitz, area. So it's right at near Powell Butte. I can see if I can so right near southern Colorado. So if you look up Kuiperowitz, southern Utah, there's a big, huge kind of sandstone like hills that are just hundreds of feet high is where we were working.
So this is not the Escalante in Utah?
It's like within 30 or 40 miles from it. Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right. Let's see, I'm just gonna kind of go down, and then we have some others popping in. So in excavating the Ziegler Reservoir, what did they do with all that soil that was removed?
Yeah, great question. So some of the soil, we bagged up hundreds of bags and took it back to the Denver Museum to sift through. And we found tons and tons of bits and pieces of plant material and tons of little fossil material of all those tiny little salamanders, mice, all sorts of different little bones. And this was also where you could find, just a variety of different things. So it's kind of a mishmash. and then schools, some of the schools that were participating that had in Colorado, I think a few teachers that were science teachers actually worked with the Denver Museum and got the small bags to work with their classroom and try to sift through some of the material to find
Okay,
stuff and
and
send
was
it
that
back to the
most,
museum.
oh, sorry. Was that mostly the peat or clay, or it just ended up being a mixture?
Yeah, it's mostly the peat, but that's a great question. The clay was kind of devoid of, a lot of stuff. It's just, you think of it as just this block of clay. You can't really get through it. There's not a lot of stuff in it. But in the peat, there's just a lot of material, just tons of plant material. And I had some other pictures I forgot to show, but when we would open the peat, the old peat, some of the actual plant material of these sedges were still green.
No
And they
way.
would oxidize within hours after being exposed to the environment. So that was I was like, holy cow, that was so cool. Um,
Yeah, so that leads me to the next question. Why didn't they just stop the reservoir project with all of this being found there?
well, that's a great question. That is above my pay grade, but I think, these things were planned well in advance from the county and the city of Snowmass, and and they had contracts. The Denver Museum, we were lucky enough to get in there to collect this stuff. There's a lot of places around the country where they put in oil and gas, sites, and let's say in Alaska or other states, and paleontological groups aren't there, and so we never get to recover the stuff. So I look at it as kind of like, you got to look at the positive. Like, we're able to get some of the great stuff, and it's and so that's just kind of like my perspective of it.
Yeah. How did the number of bones that you found there compared to, say, like the Brea tar pits or a place like that?
Yeah, that's well, not probably not quite as many as La Brea, but it comes in probably a close, in the Pleistocene world of Ice Age animals, it comes in probably a close second. But there's probably a magnitude. I don't know how many more that are at La Brea than at Snowmass, but I think if you had, individual bones in Snowmass, we're probably 20 to 30,000. I don't know how many at La Brea. It's probably closer to 100,000.
Okay. All right. So now to the paleontology aspect of it.
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on this, but maybe you can just pick it up again. Were some of your cones possibly brewer spruce? And as you said, you kind of started looking at that theory. Do you want to explain any more about that?
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so this is something I've been looking into in the last couple of years, and the Oregon State University herbarium actually has a small collection of brewer spruces in cones in their collection, and so I was like eager to go through and take a look at them. The cone scales and some of the rough morphology of the cone looks very similar, but when you get down to the bracts, they are significantly different. So I, probably can rule out brewer spruce for the tent. Yeah, we can rule that out. So
Okay, and follow up again, kind of to that idea. And you just touched on this about using DNA
yeah,
extraction to help kind of solve some of these mysteries.
yeah. So there's actually a lot of work being done on this in the right now, not necessarily at Snowmass, but just across the country. There's We had a couple researchers, Hendrik Poignard and Beth Shapiro, and they're both a part of this. You've probably seen it in the news, this project where they're trying to recreate mastodons in some tech lab in Texas or something, but they're like key scientists on it. But at the stuff that we found, when they took the DNA samples from the bone, they drill into it and sample it, and then they go back to their labs where their universities are. They wear all just complete, it's kind of like they look like they're in hazmat suits because they don't want to contaminate any of the their own DNA or any of the outside DNA into that that environment. And what they found, unfortunately, is that what we kind of already knew, that it was like they sampled the bison bone and they could say that it was a bison, but they couldn't say like, what, lineage it came from or anything like that. It's just, DNA 100,000 years old is very degraded and it breaks down. And so you're not left with a lot of material to, figure out what's going on with that information. So, but I think just keep an eye out in the news. There is more techniques and people are actually exploring that pretty, more rapidly these days.
Yeah. And so did you date the cones then according to the soils that were surrounding them?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So I know we kind of went through we had a lot of slides, but so, in some of those slides that were showing like, 5E, 5D, those would correspond to either a warming or a cooling period tied to where the cones are. And so if you're interested there, of wanting to learn a little bit more about that, I think you can look up the paper I wrote on the fossil cones. It kind of, would tie the cones to different specific time intervals of what we could, of where we could best pinpoint them. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna pause here and let Elisa Esme, she's had her hand up.
Sure.
Go ahead and verbalize her question.
Hello. This is not related to your presentation, but inherent to it. I saw that I'm actually interested in learning more about data science, and I noticed that you did a boot camp with Thinkful. Is
Yeah.
that something you would recommend to those of us?
Yeah, that's I mean, I thought it was a great program. There's a lot of different kind of data science programs out there, so you can kind of do a little browsing around. Feel free to you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to chat a little bit more about it. But depends on what your goal is. If you want to, depending on if you want to get in the weeds of doing the programming and stuff, you probably need to learn some Python. But if you want to do a little bit more of like kind of reporting and dashboard kind of stuff, then I would, kind of look at programs that are a little bit more on the Power BI Tableau side. So.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
That was a great detour.
Yeah, worries.
Yeah.
No, I'm happy to help. Yeah, I mean, I've given these kind of talks for when I was first getting into data science. I would like push myself out there and I would like give talks on SQL. And while I was living in the Bay Area, which was kind of interesting as a science teacher, but.
Well, certainly many of your charts, we can see that background coming through.
Yeah. Exactly.
And then somebody did mention about how fascinating isotope studies are. So.
Oh, yeah.
Was there anything specific that isotope studies were able to divulge that you couldn't find from all these other methods?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So the isotope stuff has been that's science that has been ironed out in a different study I wasn't part of. But if you're interested in that, there's a researcher by the name of James Zachow from, I think, where is it? Santa Cruz University, and he's kind of like the godfather of a lot of this stuff in the paleo world. So there's a lot of really good information around there. One of the things, there's so much science at the Snowmass site, but they did this other kind of a new technique, which was or a relatively newer technique, which was looking at how the quartz crystals in the sediment had last been exposed to light since they had been buried. And I can't remember the name of it, but it's a study where they have to, they take a ton of sediment, they run it through a variety of different machines, and they kind of can analyze, that certain crystals have more exposure to sunlight over a certain period of time than others, and they can give you kind of an age estimate of how long something has been buried. So there's a couple different techniques that were used at the site. So, but yeah, that's a great question.
Okay, we'll let Adam go ahead and ask his own question there.
Hey, curious if you were able to perceive any influence of the megafauna on the plant communities. Did you find any evidence of like a spruce parkland, or any way that the mastodons might have been browsing and influencing the plant community?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a great question. I think it's inferred, so indirect evidence. So if you were to, if you've read anything about elephants and other megafauna in Africa, they bulldoze down forests, different areas, and they kind of open it up. I mean, that's just what they do. And so there's some researchers, one in particular, Dan Fisher from University of Michigan. He was the expert on mammoths and mastodons, and he kind of was really filling us in on sort of how these animals probably interacted with the ecology up at Snowmass. But to really find that evidence is pretty hard. But there may have been some evidence of the tusks rubbing against trees, but there's a lot of tusks that were damaged, where mastodons would fight each other and they would have broken ribs that were, you could see the pathology of them, kind of like I don't know, what the fusing back together, or broken tusks. And so they were more aggressive animals, and I think I think they're, you can look up of what his hypotheses are, but I'm sure that they probably bulldozed down some of the smaller trees and shrubbery around that area. But unfortunately, it's just really hard to paint that picture with that evidence in the paleontological record. That's a great question, though.
So George Thornton says
Yeah.
hello.
Yeah, that's my
Anything
uncle
to
George. Yeah. Hey, George.
I don't know if he wants to get on and say anything.
It's all right. Yeah, we
Yeah,
need
he
to
says a
connect.
long way since Chopaka.
Yeah. So this is yeah, so when I was in as an undergraduate at Seattle University, I worked with my uncle. This is kind of prior to getting into all the paleo stuff, was this area up in the North kind of at the edge of the North Cascades in the Okanagan County, and this mountain that was rounded off, and they call it a nunatak, which is it's like a mountain that is free of ice. And so the ice went around it, and there's kind of like, we think that, a refuge for plants. And George helped me get into the plant native plant world we went and collected and surveyed gentians up at high elevation up there. It's really cool, and I contributed to a Native Plant Society little bulletin in Washington. So with that work when I was in undergrad. So
Well, see, that was worth it for you to
yeah,
explain about
no,
your
it's definitely
gentian.
worth it. Yeah,
And you have lots of family connections, it sounds like.
yeah. Well, family's great.
Yeah.
I always keep it close.
Okay, let's see. Speaking of up north, have you ever done any work or heard of any work looking for fossils in the Bonneville Lake that then the Missoula floods came from, or Missoula
Yeah.
Lake and Bonneville Lake, and yeah, those lakes
Um, let's see.
or remnants.
Not off the top of my head, but I'm sure there are a number of things. I think some of those Bonneville Lakes, Dry Falls area and stuff like that, the scablands. There's a whole fascinating area of Earth history in the Pacific Northwest and into the Portland area of these gigantic ice age floods. And so if you were an animal or a plant around those giant floods, you're probably there, the chance of getting fossilized was probably pretty small, but some of the lakes that were, not having that influx of, massive amounts of water coming through. These are called the Missoula floods that you may have looked up, or you could Google it. But yeah, I'm sure there's fossils in Bonneville Lake, different things like that. People have done palynology studies. The University of Washington. Linda Brubaker has done a lot of work on that. And so, but I can't recall off the top of my head, but I wish I could. But
All righty. Well, thank you so much.
yeah,
Such an in-depth trip for us, and so many connections. I love all the BRAC work. What a wonderful presentation.
thank
And
you.
certainly inspired us in different ways.
Oh, cool. Yeah, reach
Yeah.
out if you have questions. I love connecting people to different things and museums or different people that are, scientists and stuff. I have a lot of different tentacles out there, so feel free to reach out.